episode 5 of the Community Podcast, and I'm your host, Madonna. Our guest today is Naila Farouky, the Executive Director of the Arab Foundations Forum. As a leader that convenes such a powerful and broad collective of philanthropists, she has a lot to unpack with you, our audience, about the forum's journey in addressing the climate challenge. Are you wondering if your current program areas or philanthropy strategy aligns with climate? This is the conversation for you. Naila brings a fresh perspective to this conversation, taking us through what it means to rethink a foundation's giving strategy to incorporate climate philanthropy within their work. This season is brought to you by South Africa in collaboration with Wings and the Philanthropy for Climate movement. So Naila, it's lovely hosting you on the Community Podcast. Tell us about yourself and the organization that you're currently working with before we get into all this work that you're doing around the climate challenge.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you and to have this conversation. I really appreciate it. And I am currently the CEO of the Arab Foundations Forum, which is a membership-based association of donors and funders and other philanthropy actors that are working across the 22 country Arab region. I am currently based in Cairo. I'm originally half Egyptian, half Palestinian, and I've lived between Cairo and New York those are the two biggest places that I've lived in my life. But I've also lived in Kenya and in South Africa. And in Jordan. So I was raised in Cairo and then I spent maybe the first 25 years of my life in Cairo, and then I moved to the US, and then I came back once I got this job at the Arab Foundations Forum. So that's kind of the background. And I'll just tell you a very quick little bit background of the Arab Foundations Forum, just for context. So Arab Foundations Forum, or AFF, was originally founded in 2006 by a group of executive directors of various foundations across the Arab region. It was founded as a Belgian association originally, and then with a kind of operational office that was founded in Jordan, in Amman. And then in 2011, it became an independent entity. So for the first 5 years, it was actually a sub-project of a larger organization. And in 2011, it registered as an independent entity. And I came on board in 2014. The aim of the forum essentially was to bring together a convening space, or like to create a convening space for foundations and donors working in the Arab region. And then over the last 8.5 years since I've come on board, we've kind of evolved a little bit in terms of the criteria for membership at the forum. And that was really, the impetus for that was inspired by looking at the ecosystem of philanthropy in our region, and recognizing that as one of the only networks of its kind, really, in the 22 country region, we felt like it wasn't enough to just represent foundations and grant makers, but to also open it up a little bit more to some other actors working across the philanthropy sector. So as of this year, we've actually broadened the criteria for membership. And so it includes individuals and researchers and, philanthropy consultants, research centers, as well as universities and think tanks, et cetera. So it's kind of been the network has been evolving in terms of what it represents and also how it serves its network. And that will take us into our climate conversation, but I'll stop here.
Just appreciating how diverse the membership is. And I think it also shows, maybe it may show in the work that you do and the approaches that you take, that it's so many heads coming together to, solve complex issues. I think it must be a very impressive space to work with. So we're doing this podcast in partnership with Wings, specifically because of the Philanthropy for Climate movement. Mm-hmm. Before we talk about that, what comes to mind when you think about the climate challenge that we're facing globally, and how is AFF addressing that?
Sure. I mean, look, I'll tell you a little bit just to kind of give again some context into how we even got involved in the climate conversation. So, as a network, AFF is pretty sector agnostic, right? Because our members range from working in education, health, and other. I mean, it's all we don't specify what kind of strategic focus our members address. Our members address a variety of different strategic focus areas. So climate wasn't really part of the agenda of any of the members that were part of our network. And I kind of got roped into the climate conversation, probably I would say sometime in 2017. And I got invited to attend a kind of small working group with the F20, which is the Foundations 20, which is one of the groups that reports back into the G20 summit every year. And so this was when the G20 summit was going to be hosted in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And I was invited by the F20 to kind of give some insight on the climate conversations happening in the Arab region. So to be very honest, at that time, this was completely new to me. And the climate space was completely new to me. And I had misconceptions, as I've realized, have many people have misconceptions about what it means to be involved in the climate space. That, we've kind of traditionally thought, oh, that means you have to either be a climate scientist or an environmentalist. But as I've learned more and more about what the various aspects of that conversation are, I've recognized that actually pretty much everything that we do, whether in the philanthropy space or any other sector, is somehow related to climate. So part of my education by the F20 group was to recognize that, actually, it doesn't matter whether or not you're sector agnostic. Pretty much any sector that you're involved with has some impact on this climate conversation and has some input into the climate conversation. So that was kind of my first introduction. So I attended, the F20 event in Argentina in the lead up to the G20 summit there. I also attended a smaller kind of breakout group with the F20, with other climate actors and activists who were looking at how to leverage philanthropy in the climate conversation. So that started back in 2017. In the years since, I've sort of, I've kept that connection with the F20 group. So I've spoken at almost, I think, every one of their F20 and philanthropy conversation kind of sessions over the last couple of years. I gave a keynote speech, I think, at their last year at the G20, the F20 leading up to the G20 summit last year. So I've kind of had that peripheral engagement at that level. And then in October of last year, when it was, the presidency for COP27 was going to be announced, we realized that actually COP27 and COP28 were going to be taking place in the Arab region. So COP27 in Egypt and COP28 in the Arab Emirates. And this kind of led a little bit of a rush by the philanthropy sector in the region to kind of figure out, COP is coming to our region. We really better get, kind of organized around the climate conversation. And we as AFF saw an opportunity then to reach out to our membership and say, okay, we hope to be able to serve as some sort of representation for you as a network, as a convening space with our other international partners. So that would have included at the time the F20, and then eventually also included Wings and some more, some other actors in that space, including like the Climate for Emergency Collaboration Group and some other groups active in that space. And it really was just around this idea that we have an opportunity now with COP coming to our region to be able to represent the philanthropy sector and its activities in climate. But as we got closer and closer to COP, we became more and more aware that there still hadn't been really any kind of meaningful movement around putting the climate crisis and the nature crisis on the agenda of our membership. So the various members in our network had yet to actually, strategically place the climate crisis and the nature crisis on their agenda, whether it's for funding or for programmatic support or whatever it was. So that's kind of the background of how AFF got involved.
I like that you mentioned something around recognizing that climate isn't specifically for, environmentalists and scientists studying, things that are climate specific. I'm just curious to know what are some of those approaches that the foundations and even just AFF is employing to address this challenge, things that would typically, that take us away from the traditional approach to addressing the climate challenge.
Yeah. A lot of it, Madonna, really was just conversations with our membership. And I'll tell you, like, honestly, at one point when I first kind of got involved into this conversation, I felt a little bit overwhelmed by the task of having to maybe have these discussions with my members, knowing that they hadn't really, they hadn't put any focus on the climate conversation. And so at first I remember just feeling like, I don't want to push people away by making it seem like, oh my God, the climate crisis is completely urgent and we're all going to die and we're all going to drown. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't want it to become this very kind of overwhelming and off-putting part of the conversation. Yeah. And that's how we came to the realization of, actually, wait a second. Every one of the issues that you are dealing with as foundations, and as other NGOs in this sector, is somewhat related to climate. And for me personally, I mean, I don't speak on behalf of my other members because I'm sure they're far more clued into the reasons why they decided the climate crisis was important for them. But for me, that pivotal moment was, I had very recently been asked to join the advisory board of the International Mental Health Care Alliance, and I'm completely butchering the name of the organization. It's not or of the alliance. It's the International Mental Health Association or something like that. Anyway, or Funders Alliance. Yeah. Anyway, and I remember telling the alliance, like, guys, I'm not in the climate. Like, I'm not in the climate space. In the mental health space. I don't work in the mental health space. And the executive director of the coalition was like, oh, don't you work in philanthropy? Aren't you working across?
It's a catalyst in a sense.
Right, so exactly. So she's like, aren't you working with funders that fund environment, that fund, et cetera, et cetera? And I said, yes. And she's like, well, all of those things have an impact on mental health, and vice versa. Mental health has an impact on all of those things. And so at the very first advisory board meeting with the mental health group, I realized that actually, even mental health is somehow related to all of the different aspects of the sector that my members are addressing. And so then by extension, the climate crisis has a similar connection. So that was kind of the moment for me where I thought, oh, this is a way where I can kind of bring people into the conversation by saying, you don't have to be specifically working on climate. You don't have to be specifically working on environment, but you as a funder of youth education, or you as a funder of health, or you as a funder of scholarships, or whatever it is, you are somehow tangentially or directly related to the climate conversation. That's how we got that conversation started.
Yeah. And as you talked about that, I just remembered something that usually comes up in philanthropy conversations, enabling environment for philanthropy. But I think more than ever, philanthropy enables the environment for such issues to be addressed, regardless of the issue, whether it's mental health, whether it's climate, just by virtue of philanthropy being what it is. It's an enabler of solutions that, work towards eliminating these challenges. So
right.
What have been your lessons that you're drawing from this journey so far? I know you talked about conversations and a possible mindset shift in even the foundations that are sort of maybe thinking in a very linear way, like this is what we were, we established this foundation to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but here you are telling us, climate could actually be one of the things we are addressing. So what are some of the lessons and insights you'd like to share with us around this journey so far?
So one of them is just to reiterate again, having the approach, right? How we formulated the approach. So it was to say, okay, we represent a network of organizations that are doing X, Y, and Z, but at the same time, we'd like to bring them into this conversation in a way that is accessible and isn't off-putting or overwhelming. And so it was exactly like you said, it was creating these conversations that were more about, let's talk about where you have already been working in this space rather than you guys need to completely change everything you're doing and work in climate, right? So we looked at it as, how do you enhance what you're already doing by adding a climate agenda to it rather than shifting or pivoting away from what you're doing to address climate? That was one thing. So finding the spaces where there was synergy. And then I think the second thing really was to look at our own role as a convener and as a representative of the sector. And again, as I mentioned in the very beginning, we really are the only network of our kind across the region. Which, if you think about it in comparison to some other countries around the world, so for example, just because it's comparable in terms of population. So the United States has a population of about 390 million people, I think, whereas the Arab region, 22 countries, has a population of about 410 million. So it's kind of comparable in size. The US has about 3,000 organizations that are similar to AFF, okay, that are network representatives for the sector, whether it's small foundations, large foundations, international foundations, et cetera, et cetera. The Arab region has one. So we couldn't kind of depend or rely on other organizations to carry that mantle of, bringing foundations into the conversation around climate and nature, and felt like, okay, we know that this is an urgent issue, right, globally. And then again, Madonna, like coming out of going into now our third year of a pandemic, of an absolute health crisis, there's no way to ignore, right, or deny the fact that there has to be some connection to this climate crisis with this, advent of potentially fatal, viruses being released across the globe. So I think, you'd have to be hit on the head with something if you weren't recognizing that there has to be some kind of connection for this to be a global issue, right? And then I think the other thing was also to get educated around this problem. And for me, a lot of the insights that have been very interesting. I think I knew this as a civilian. Do you know what I mean? Just as a human person who reads and whatever. I think I kind of knew that the global south, for example, which is obviously the region of the world that I'm the most passionate about, number one, just by virtue of where I'm from and by virtue of the work that I do, that the global south is the least contributing to the climate crisis, but then the most impacted by the climate crisis. And for me, that was kind of, again, like an impetus for a call to action amongst our members, right? Is to say, look, guys, we may not be the reason why the world is falling apart, but we are very much at the receiving end of some of the consequences of that. And so given that, and given the second kind of big opportunity of having one of the largest youth populations in the world. So out of about 410 million people in the Arab region, about 50% of them are under the age of 25. So that's the highest rate, the highest demographic of youth worldwide in terms of a concentration. So, and not only are 50% of our youth this opportunity for kind of advancing information around climate, but they also are going to be the inheritors of this crisis, right? But they also happen to be some of the most disenfranchised demographic. And so again, there was the second thing of thinking about, okay, how do we galvanize the giving around our sector in our region to not only work towards youth empowerment, but then how can that youth empowerment also be used to leverage climate, addressing the climate crisis. So there's a lot of kind of little, trying to piece a number of different things together so that we could start addressing and bringing to the forefront some of these bigger global issues that we feel our region can have an impact on.
Wow. I really just appreciate the generational thinking that you put to this. at one point it used to be a threat, right? It was talked about as a threat. Now it's here.
Yeah.
So instead of just handling the consequences of what's happening right now, that we're even thinking further to the future, the youth that will, live to see probably worse. Hopefully not. Yeah, but based on the work that you're doing, we hope that things will definitely turn around and that we don't have to see feel the bare brunt of the effects of climate change. Our listeners are usually individuals, sometimes grassroots organizations that are in one way or another doing something about the challenges that face the different communities. And given that we're talking about climate change, is there some wisdom you'd like to pass on, a piece of advice or call to action that you'd like to share with them, given how you've addressed it in your context? Really just thoughts and advice on how they could address this.
I think one of the biggest things that I felt have really helped us and helped AFF has been leveraging the power of our partnerships and networks and not trying to do everything by ourselves, which would have been impossible. Okay. I mean, I'm just telling you right now, like my organization is a very, very small team of people. We've faced a lot of challenges and restrictions over the last couple of years that we're just coming out of now. We've just relaunched with a kind of evolved new structure, whether it's a governance structure, whether it's our membership structure, like I mentioned, having, broadened the scope of who's eligible to be a member. So while that's brought in a much more diverse group of people, which I'm so grateful for, because I feel like that was the whole point. I didn't want AFF to remain or to be a kind of elite small group of just donors, which anyway, to be very honest with you, in the Arab region, there aren't that many of just strictly foundations in kind of like the sense that we understand it in the Western taxonomy. We don't have that many. Most of the grant makers in this region, with few exceptions, but most of the grant makers in this region tend to be sort of this hybrid model of grant givers as well as grant seekers. So, that was one thing, is that I knew there's no way that we can do this by ourselves. And that's where, leveraging the partnerships and the engagement with groups like Wings and with other organizations. I mean, the Wings, I've been involved with Wings since I came on at AFF. I was recently the chair of the board of Wings. I'm currently the treasurer of the board of Wings, and have been very, very engaged with Wings. But, we've had this long-standing kind of relationship with Wings and other organizations like it that already have been doing some work and can help either, give us a platform for some visibility for our region, for our network, whereas we don't have to kind of start all of this from scratch. And then it also kind of helped us with looking at, learning from others who have already been doing this before us. And so Wings has been invaluable in that regard, but then so have these other organizations that I've more recently come in contact with, like the Climate Emergency Collaboration Group based in the UK and others. And looking, for example, I mean, we were at COP27. I was at COP27 this year for a couple of days and had, invaluable meetings with people who are globally doing this and have globally kind of also put out the invitation for other regions and other networks to join. So it's that kind of, never underestimate, number one, the power of networks, and then never underestimate the power of partnerships. So, I mean, that's really the biggest piece that I would say, is that for me, what was the most helpful was, number one, looking at this issue and trying to fit it into bite-sized pieces so that we wouldn't be too overwhelmed to address it. And then secondly, look for the people who can help. And that's kind of I think that's how we got to, I mean, I'll tell you, Madonna, like for 2023, our strategic priorities have added climate as one of our programmatic areas.
Wow. That's it's a whole transformative thing, right?
Yes, it's a full circle, right? It starts from 2017 with literally just an invitation by the F20 group and me honestly saying, like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I have no idea. To now, coming 5 years later, or how many years later? It was 2017 and 5 years, right? 5 years later, saying we're going to actually put climate as one of our 4 programmatic strategic areas.
Wow. That's absolutely impressive just seeing your journey. I recently had a conversation with someone that was talking about monitoring and evaluation and then the learning, right? But after you've done all these things, if they change you, that's when the learning happens. So I'm glad to know that you've learned and even just put that in practice in as part of your strategy as an organization. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with us?
I think the only thing, just given that you are, you have this podcast, you've got obviously listeners that are coming from across mostly is it Africa? Is it across Africa? Is it, I just am more sorry, go ahead.
I think it's really broad. Some are from the West, the USA, UK, the Netherlands, and then South Africa, Kenya, and Uganda.
Great. Yeah. So, I think for me, what would be really interesting and helpful, and I've been trying to do this for many, many years, and for some reason it just, it never quite pans out the way you want to because everybody gets busy. But I am very, very interested in kind of connecting more with organizations based in Africa that are working on this as well, so that we can do some kind of, cross-continental learning. The Arab region includes countries in Africa as well. So that's, in our North Africa countries. So that's kind of one of the issues that I'd be interested in, is to sort of have some more connectivity with my African colleagues, to understand a little bit more about what they're doing in this space and talk a little bit more about that and share a bit of our lessons learned. And then beyond that is really to say to anyone kind of working in this space, interested in, first of all, getting any insight on how we are moving forward as the Arab region, as a representative of philanthropy in the Arab region, as we move towards COP28, which, preparations are already in place for, reach out to me and let me know how we can, help, how we can collaborate. I really want, as much collaboration around this issue as possible.
So even to our listeners, I think this is really just a call to them as they listen into this conversation. Thank you so much, Naila. I don't know if you had anything more to share. I know the questions could be a bit limiting, but feel free to let us know if there's anything else you'd like to
thank
share.
You so much. I just appreciate this conversation. I appreciate your questions. And I, look forward to seeing if we can kind of talk more and learn a bit more. That would be wonderful.
Thank you.